Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Ready for a deep dive today into the philosophy of parenthood and procreation.
Oh, yeah. Timeless and timely, right?
It really is. And, since you're a philosopher,
More than just diapers.
exactly, we're going to go beyond, the practical stuff and really wrestle with some pretty big questions about human existence.
The
So,
deep stuff.
the deep stuff. We're drawing on some seriously heavy philosophical material today from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to guide this deep dive. So,
Get those thinking caps on.
exactly, yeah. Get ready to untangle procreative autonomy, the morality of having children, and how these ideas bump up against, well, everything from individual rights to the whole future of society. So
It's going to be a good one. It's a deep dive into what it means to be human, I think.
it really is. And I think a great place to start is with this concept of procreative autonomy. It's like the cornerstone of how we think about family. But what does it actually mean to have the right to decide whether or not to have children? Like, what does that right actually mean?
Well, that's where the philosophy comes in, right? Is this right a fundamental human right? Like, the right to free speech? Or is it a totally different thing? And if it is a right, what kind of right is it?
Right. So many different ways to think about this. I'm curious how philosophers approach it. Like, what are the different schools of thought on this?
Well, one way to break it down is to think about negative and positive rights. A negative right is about freedom from something, like freedom from interference, right?
Okay.
So, like freedom of speech. The government can't stop you from saying what you think.
Makes sense.
So, in the context of procreation, a negative right means no one can force you to have kids or stop you from having them.
Ah, got it, got it. So basically the government can't tell you how many kids to have.
Right, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about a positive right to procreation? What would that even look like?
Positive rights are different. It's not just about being left alone. It's about an entitlement. Like you're entitled to something. So maybe it's access to fertility treatments or financial help to raise kids. It's about what society owes you, right?
Wow, that's a really different way to think about it, right? Like, society actually has an obligation to help people become parents. I bet different philosophical camps have some pretty strong opinions about this.
Oh, absolutely. Like liberals, for example, they really focus on individual autonomy, right?
Right.
So they often see procreative autonomy as this negative right, like we were talking about. They point to people like John Locke, who said we have this basic right to own ourselves, and that includes control over our bodies and choices about reproduction.
Oh, interesting. So for liberals, it's about protecting people from being told what to do with their bodies and their families.
Yeah, exactly.
What about other perspectives?
Well, then you have the repro-libertarians. They take this whole freedom thing even further, right? They're all about minimal regulation, even for things like, genetic selection or cloning.
Whoa, that's pretty out there.
It is. But their argument is basically, hey, as long as no one's getting hurt, people should be free to make their own choices about reproduction.
I mean, it sounds good on the surface, but wouldn't some people say that some of these technologies could be misused?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where you start hearing from more conservative viewpoints.
Makes sense.
They often put a lot of emphasis on the traditional family structure. They worry about shaking things up too much.
I can see that.
And they're also wary of technology. Like, what if unchecked advancements lead us down a dangerous path, right? Towards something like eugenics, where the government tries to control who has kids and who doesn't?
That is a scary thought.
For sure. It really highlights this tension between those who are all about individual choice and those who think we need some rules of the road?
Definitely a tricky balance to strike. It sounds like there's a lot of nuance within each of these perspectives too, right?
Totally. Like, take feminists, for example.
Yeah, I was just thinking about them. They're all about empowerment. So how do they think about this whole procreative autonomy thing?
Well, for feminists, it's obviously crucial that women have control over their bodies and their reproductive decisions,
Yeah.
but they're also really good at spotting those potential problems. They point out how policies can sometimes backfire and actually hurt women or make existing power imbalances even worse.
Could you give an example of that?
Sure, think about surrogacy. For some women, it's empowering, right? But for others, it can be exploitative, especially, in international surrogacy where there's a huge gap in wealth and power.
Wow. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it like that.
And don't forget about the history of forced sterilization, especially for women of color. It's a chilling reminder that reproductive policies can be used to oppress people, too.
That's a really powerful point. So feminists are basically saying, yes, women should have control over their bodies and their reproductive choices, but let's be really smart about how we do this, right?
Exactly. They're all about thinking about the bigger picture and making sure that everyone benefits, not just a select few. And they often bring this idea of feminist care ethics to the table.
Oh, interesting. What's that all about?
Well, it's about putting relationships and responsibilities at the center, especially when it comes to caregiving and reproduction.
That makes sense.
It's not just about individual rights, but about how we care for each other and build strong communities.
So we've got liberals, repro-libertarians, conservatives, and feminists all weighing in on procreative autonomy. That's a lot of different perspectives. But there's another one that takes an even more, shall we say, radical approach. Antinatalism, have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah. Antinatalism is the belief that bringing new people into the world is morally wrong. Kind of a bold statement, right?
It is. Why would someone believe that?
Well, there are a couple of flavors of antinatalism. Some, called local antinatalists, say it's wrong to have kids in specific situations, like when you know they're going to suffer.
Oh, I see. So, like, if you know your child will be born with a serious medical condition, for example, you might choose not to have them out of concern for their suffering.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's the global antinatalists.
Okay.
They say it's always wrong to procreate no matter what. They'll point to the inherent suffering in life or the environmental burden of adding more people to the planet.
Those are some heavy arguments for sure.
It just,
Definitely makes you think.
it does, right. It gets right to the heart of why we're here, what the purpose of life is, even.
I'm curious, as a philosopher, how all of this connects with those classic ethical theories. Like utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. Do those come into play here?
Oh, totally. And that's where it gets really fascinating, I think. For a utilitarian, the big question is, does more happiness mean more people or fewer people?
Right, right.
A deontologist might ask, do we have a duty to procreate? Or a duty not to? Or is it just a personal choice? And then for a virtue ethicist, it's all about character.
Mhm.
Like, what kind of person do you become by being a parent?
So many different ways to look at it. It seems like all these different ethical theories could lead to very different conclusions.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've only just begun to explore the philosophy of parenthood and procreation. There's so much more to uncover.
Yeah, it's like opening a whole new chapter, right? Because we're moving from these big ideas about procreative autonomy to like the real world stuff, the technologies that are changing how we think about making families, assisted reproductive technologies,
What's
BAR
that?
tests.
RT, right. Gamete donation, IVF, surrogacy. It's like science fiction becoming a reality, and it really throws a wrench into the whole philosophical discussion, doesn't it?
It does. Each technology comes with its own ethical baggage, forcing us to reconsider those big questions we've been talking about. What is a parent, really? What are the rights and duties, and where do we draw the line when technology gives us so much power over the whole process?
Okay, so much to unpack there. Let's start with something seemingly simple, like gamete donation. You have sperm banks, egg donors. What's the philosophical problem there? Well, even with something like gamete donation, you run into those core issues of procreative autonomy and the nature of parenthood. Like, imagine someone who strongly believes in a genetic basis for parenthood.
Okay.
For them, the idea of anonymous gamete donation is going to be really troubling. It cuts the tie between biological lineage and parental rights and duties.
Right, because if you think your genes make you a parent, donating anonymously feels like giving up a fundamental right or even a moral obligation.
Exactly. And even if you don't have that strict genetic view, anonymous gamete donation raises questions about the child's right to know where they came from. Some argue that knowing your biological parents is essential for developing your identity, and denying that knowledge is a violation of their rights.
That's interesting. It makes you think about nature versus nurture, right? How much of who we are comes from our genes versus how we're raised. And if knowing your genetic history is that important, what does it mean for the rights of kids conceived through donation?
Huge questions, and philosophers are still debating them. And it gets even trickier when you consider the ethical implications for the donors themselves. Do they have any responsibilities toward the children they helped create, even without legal parental rights?
That's a good question. They're not raising the child, but they did contribute something pretty essential, their genes. Does that create some kind of moral obligation, even if it's not a legal one?
That's the debate. Some say yes, they've taken on a significant responsibility, even if it's not spelled out in law. Others argue that their role is ultimately less important than the social parents who raised the child.
Wow, so much to think about already, and we haven't even gotten to IVF and surrogacy.
Just wait. IVF brings a whole other layer of issues, especially concerning embryos. For those who believe an embryo is a person with full moral status, the process of IVF, which often involves creating multiple embryos, raises a lot of ethical red flags.
Right, because what happens to the embryos that aren't implanted? Is there a moral obligation to keep them alive? Can we destroy them, use them for research? Those are huge questions.
Huge. The whole debate about the moral status of embryos touches on some fundamental ideas about when life begins, what makes someone a person. It gets to the heart of it all.
IVF almost feels like this real-life thought experiment playing out in fertility clinics all over the world.
I know, right? And then there's surrogacy, which throws even more fuel on the fire.
Okay, surrogacy definitely seems like the most ethically charged of these ARTs. It brings up questions about commodification, exploitation, even the very definition of parenthood.
No doubt. One of the biggest questions is whether it's okay to pay a woman to carry a child for someone else. Does it exploit women, turning them into baby-making machines? Or is it a mutually beneficial agreement between two adults, each freely making their own choices?
I can see both sides of that argument. It could be empowering for women to have that control, but there's a real concern that vulnerable women could be taken advantage of, especially if there are power imbalances or economic disparity.
It's a real dilemma. And then you add the question of who's the parent. If a woman gives birth to a child she has no genetic connection to, is she a parent? What about the intended parents? Who has the stronger claim?
It challenges everything we thought we knew about family and parenthood. And international surrogacy adds even more complexity, with different laws and cultural norms to consider.
Absolutely. Each of these technologies, gamete donation, IVF, surrogacy, pushes us to revisit those philosophical foundations. Procreative autonomy, the morality of having kids, and what it means to be a parent. It's all up for debate.
It's like we're trying to hit a moving target, right? Technology is constantly evolving, pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
It is, and we need to keep asking these questions because the answers will shape the future of families and societies.
Okay, so we've covered the right to have kids, the technologies that are changing how we create families. But we haven't really dug into the philosophy of what makes someone a parent in the first place, like beyond the biology of it all.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And philosophers have been wrestling with it for centuries.
Well, let's wrestle with it. What are the main theories out there?
It really is. And it gets to the heart of what it means to be a parent, you know? These philosophical accounts of parenthood, they try to get at, like, what makes someone a parent beyond just, biology.
Right, so it's more than just you provided the sperm, you're the dad kind of thing. So what are some of the leading theories here?
Well, one big one is geneticism. It basically says that biological parentage, that's the basis for parental rights and responsibilities. Your genes make you a parent. That connection really matters legally and morally.
It makes sense, on a basic level. I mean, genes are pretty fundamental to who we are, but I guess there are some problems with that purely genetic view, right? Like, what about all the other ways people become parents?
Exactly. It doesn't really account for adoptive parents or other caregivers who play a huge role in a child's life, right? And it kind of misses the bigger picture. Parenthood is so much more than passing on genes, right? It's about care and teaching and guiding and shaping a whole person. It's a huge thing.
Right, so just sharing DNA doesn't really capture the whole depth of what it means to be a parent.
Yeah.
What are some of the other ways philosophers think about this?
Another theory is the labor-based account. It really focuses on the work involved in raising a child. All that physical, emotional, financial investment.
Oh, yeah.
It's saying that you earn parenthood,
Yeah,
through the hard work and dedication, not just by being biologically related.
that really resonates, especially when you consider like how much goes into it even before the child is born. Pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, that's a lot.
Oh, absolutely. And this view often gives a lot of credit to the gestational mother, the woman who carries the baby and gives birth.
Right, right.
She's made this unique contribution regardless of genetics.
So from that labor-based perspective, it's not just about the biological link, but about all those actions and sacrifices that go into actually raising a child. Are there any other theories that, like, round out this discussion?
There's another one. It's called the intentional or voluntarist account. It's really interesting because it focuses on the choices and the intentions of the people involved.
So it's not biology, it's not labor, it's about actually wanting to be a parent.
Exactly. Intentionalists say those who choose to bring a child into the world and are committed to raising them, those are the real parents, regardless of genetics or, who gave birth.
That's a cool way to think about it. It kind of sidesteps some of those sticky issues, right? Like
Yeah.
adoption fits in there, and maybe even surrogacy to an extent.
Yeah, it's a way of centering the whole thing around the choices people make, their commitment, not just biology or social factors.
But I imagine even this intentionalist view has its critics, right? It can't be that simple.
Oh, for sure. One big question is like, what does it even mean to intend to be a parent? How do you define that? Does it require a lifelong commitment? What if someone changes their mind? And what about those cases where a child is conceived accidentally? Does that automatically rule out intentional parenthood?
Wow, those are some really tricky questions.
Mhm.
Trying to define intention in the context of parenthood seems like a slippery slope.
It is. And it leads some philosophers to go for a fourth account, the causal account.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
This one focuses on like who's actually responsible for bringing the child into existence.
So not genes, not labor, not intention, but the chain of events that led to the child being here.
Exactly. But even then, it's not always clear-cut. Causalists have to figure out how to define causation, especially with all these ROS we were talking about. Like, if a couple uses donor sperm, who's the causal parent? The donor, the intended father, both. It gets complicated.
The deeper we get into these philosophical accounts, the more complicated it all seems, honestly.
Yeah, it really highlights just how complex and multifaceted parenthood really is. Each of these theories, geneticism, labor-based, intentionalism, causal, they all give us a different angle on this huge, important relationship.
It's like we're looking at parenthood through like a philosophical kaleidoscope or something.
Yeah.
Each theory shows us a different pattern, a different piece of the puzzle.
That's a great way to put it. And by considering all these perspectives, we can get a much richer understanding of what parenthood means.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about what makes someone a parent, but what about the ongoing duties? What do parents owe their children besides, the obvious things like food and shelter?
Well, pretty much everyone agrees that parents have this basic duty to care for their kids, keep them safe, meet their needs. But philosophers often go further. They argue that parents have this moral obligation to help their children develop, to become independent, to be responsible members of society.
So it's not just about keeping them alive, it's about helping them thrive and really become their best selves.
Exactly. And then there's a whole debate about what exactly that means, how far those responsibilities go. Like, does it include a certain level of education, instilling specific values, supporting their career choices?
Those are the kinds of questions that keep parents up at night
There
then.
do. And it
Okay.
shows that parenting is this ongoing process,
Yeah.
learning and adapting and making tough choices. There's no magic formula for being a good parent.
It sounds like the most important thing is to be thoughtful and compassionate and willing to learn and grow alongside your kids.
I think that's a great way to sum it up.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive. We have explored parenthood and procreation from every angle, from the right to have children to the responsibilities that come with being a parent. It's been a wild ride.
It really has. We've touched on some of the biggest questions about what it means to be human, and I hope our listeners have come away with a deeper understanding of the philosophical side of families and parenting.
Me too. To our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep those philosophical wheels turning. And until next time, happy philosophizing.